5 years after Robert broke through that brick wall, life had settled into a new kind of normal. The initial frenzy of media attention had died down, though the story still occasionally resurfaced in articles about art restitution or documentaries about World War II. The museum at the mine had become a permanent fixture of the town, drawing a steady stream of visitors year-round and putting the small community on the map in a way nothing else ever had. Robert was in his early 50s now and had started thinking about retirement, though not as seriously as his wife would have liked. The truth was, he still loved his job even after all these years. There was something meditative about the work, something grounding about spending his days deep beneath the surface of the earth. But he'd also developed a second career of sorts, one he'd never anticipated. He'd become a speaker and educator, traveling to schools, museums, and conferences to share the story of the discovery and what it had taught him about history, responsibility, and the importance of returning what was stolen. One of the most rewarding aspects of the years following the discovery was seeing what happened with the artwork itself. Most families who'd received their pieces back faced difficult decisions about what to do with them. The paintings were worth substantial amounts of money, and many of the descendants were not wealthy. They could have sold the pieces and changed their financial situations dramatically, but almost universally, they chose to donate the artwork to museums instead, wanting to ensure that the public could appreciate these works and learn their stories. Ruth Goldstein's garden painting ended up in a Holocaust museum in Washington, displayed prominently with information about her grandparents and their collection. The 3 landscapes from the family in Argentina were donated to a museum in Buenos Aires, where they became centerpieces of an exhibit on stolen art and cultural heritage. Each piece found a home where it could be both preserved and appreciated, where its history could be told and remembered. The financial rewards that Robert had received allowed him to do something he'd always dreamed about, but never thought possible. He established a small scholarship fund for students in his town who wanted to pursue careers in history, archaeology, or art preservation. The first scholarship was awarded 3 years after the discovery, and seeing that young woman accept the award and talk about her dreams of becoming an art historian made Robert feel like the story had come full circle in a way. But perhaps the most unexpected development came from an international organization dedicated to locating and returning looted art. They reached out to Robert with a proposal. Would he be willing to train others in what to look for when exploring old buildings, abandoned sites, or underground spaces? His discovery had reminded the art world that major finds could still happen in unexpected places, and they wanted to prepare more people to recognize signs of hidden caches. Robert was initially skeptical. He wasn't an expert in art or history. He was just a guy who happened to hit a wall with a pickaxe. But the organization persisted, explaining that his practical experience and observational skills were exactly what they needed. So Robert found himself, at age 52, becoming something of an instructor, teaching workshops on how to identify unusual architectural features, recognize deliberate concealment, and properly document and report potential discoveries. The work took him to places he'd never imagined visiting. He traveled to Europe, examining old buildings and underground bunkers that might still contain hidden caches of looted property. He went to South America, where Nazi officers had fled after the war, potentially bringing stolen art with them. Each location taught him something new, and each experience deepened his understanding of just how widespread the looting had been and how much work remained to be done. During one trip to Poland, Robert was taken to a basement in an old building that had once been owned by a wealthy Jewish family before the war. The building had changed hands multiple times since then, and the current owners had recently discovered what appeared to be a sealed section of the basement. They wanted Robert's opinion on whether it was worth investigating. Using the skills he'd developed, Robert examined the space carefully. The wall blocking off the section was made of brick, much like the one he'd found in the mine, but this one showed signs of hasty construction. The mortar was uneven. The bricks weren't perfectly aligned. "Open it," he told the owners. "Do it carefully and document everything, but definitely open it." 2 weeks later, he received a call. Behind the wall, they'd found a collection of religious artifacts, books, and personal items that had belonged to the family who'd lived there before the war. It wasn't artwork this time, but it was still significant. pieces of Jewish cultural heritage that had been hidden to protect them from being destroyed or stolen. The discovery led to those items being properly cataloged and eventually displayed in a museum dedicated to preserving the Jewish history of the region. Back home, the museum at the Blackwood Mine continued to evolve. New exhibits were added, incorporating discoveries from around the world and telling the broader story of cultural property theft and restitution. Robert was deeply involved in these expansions, serving on the museum's advisory board and helping to ensure that the displays remained educational and respectful, never sensationalizing the tragedy, but always honoring the memory of those who'd suffered. His own family had grown closer through all of this. His grandchildren were old enough now to understand the significance of what their grandfather had found, and they'd become genuinely interested in history as a result. His grandson, in particular, had developed a fascination with archaeology and talked about wanting to become an archaeologist when he grew up. Robert took him to the museum regularly, teaching him to look at artifacts not just as objects but as connections to real people and real stories. One spring afternoon, 7 years after the initial discovery, Robert was giving a tour to a group of college students when one of them asked a question that caught him off guard. "Do you ever wonder what else is out there? I mean, if you found all this just by accident, how many other hidden caches might be waiting to be discovered?" Robert paused, considering the question carefully. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "There are probably dozens, maybe hundreds of places around the world where stolen property is still hidden. Some of it will never be found, it's been destroyed or lost to time. But some of it is out there waiting. And what I've learned is that it's not always professionals who make these discoveries. Sometimes it's just ordinary people going about their work, paying attention, being curious when they notice something unusual. That's what I was. Just someone who noticed something didn't seem right and decided to investigate." The student nodded thoughtfully. "So in a way, anyone could make a discovery like this?" "Exactly. And that's why I do these talks and workshops. I want people to know what to look for and what to do if they find something. Because every piece of stolen art that gets returned, every cultural artifact that gets preserved, that's a victory. That's history being saved and families being connected to their past. It matters." As the years continued to pass, Robert's story became part of the educational curriculum in schools throughout the region. Students learned about World War II not just as a series of battles and dates, but as a period that affected real families, stole real treasures, and left scars that took generations to heal. The Blackwood Mine discovery became a case study in how historical wrongs could be corrected, even decades after they occurred. Robert received numerous honors and awards over the years. A historical society gave him a Lifetime Achievement Award. An international organization dedicated to art restitution named him an honorary member. A university even awarded him an honorary doctorate in recognition of his contributions to cultural heritage preservation. He accepted these honors graciously, but always insisted that he was just one person in a much larger effort, part of a community of people dedicated to remembering the past and correcting its wrongs. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 10 years after the discovery, Ruth Goldstein's daughter reached out to Robert. Ruth had passed away peacefully the previous year at age 92, having lived long enough to see her grandparents' painting recovered and properly honored. In her will, she'd left a letter to be delivered to Robert. He opened it with trembling hands and read Ruth's words, written in her careful, deliberate handwriting. She thanked him not just for finding the painting, but for caring enough to see the process through, for understanding that the artwork represented more than just monetary value. She wrote about what it had meant to her to see that garden scene again, to be connected to her grandparents in such a tangible way. She ended the letter by saying that his kindness and dedication had given her peace in her final years. Knowing that there were still good people in the world who cared about justice and remembering, Robert kept that letter in his wallet, reading it whenever he needed a reminder of why his work mattered. It wasn't about fame or recognition, or even the financial rewards he'd received. It was about connecting people to their history, about righting wrongs, about ensuring that the victims of historical tragedies weren't forgotten. Now, as Robert approached retirement age, he found himself reflecting on the unexpected path his life had taken. That Tuesday morning when he'd hit his pickaxe against a brick wall had been a turning point, not just for him but for dozens of families around the world. What started as a routine day at work had become a journey that taught him about history, humanity, and the importance of paying attention to the world around you. He still worked at the mine a few days a week. Though he spent more time now with the museum and his educational work, he'd trained several other miners to recognize unusual architectural features and to understand the importance of reporting anything suspicious. Who knew? Maybe one of them would make the next big discovery. Maybe someone else would break through a wall or open a sealed room and find more pieces of history waiting to be returned. The chamber beneath the Blackwood mine remained exactly as Robert had found it, preserved as a testament to the past and a reminder of what happens when prejudice and greed go unchecked. Visitors walked through that space every day, seeing where the crates had stood, reading the stories of the families whose treasures had been hidden there. And each visitor left with a deeper understanding of history and a renewed commitment to ensuring that such crimes would never be forgotten or repeated. On warm summer evenings, Robert sometimes sat on his back porch with his wife, watching the sunset and thinking about everything that had happened since that day in the mine. His life had turned out so differently than he'd ever imagined. He'd expected to spend his career as an anonymous worker, doing honest labor and providing for his family. Instead, he'd become part of a much larger story, a story about memory and justice and the power of paying attention to details that others might miss. "Do you ever regret it?" his wife asked him one evening, as if reading his thoughts. "I mean, life was simpler before all of this. You could have just reported the wall and let someone else deal with it." Robert considered the question, then shook his head. "No regrets. Finding that chamber and seeing those paintings returned to their families, that was the most important thing I'll ever do. Not everyone gets a chance to make that kind of difference in the world. I'm grateful I had the opportunity, and he was grateful. Grateful for the accident of hitting that wall. Grateful for the families who'd welcomed him into their stories. Grateful for the chance to help correct a historical wrong. The treasure he'd found beneath the earth had changed his life in ways he never could have anticipated. But more importantly, it had changed the lives of people around the world who'd thought their history was lost forever. As the sun set and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Robert thought about all the other secrets still waiting to be discovered, all the stories still waiting to be told. History wasn't just something in books and museums. It was alive, hidden in unexpected places, waiting for someone curious enough and caring enough to find it and bring it back into the light. And that, Robert had learned, was a responsibility that belonged to everyone. The process of returning the artwork to its rightful owners turned out to be far more complicated than anyone had initially expected. While some pieces had clear documentation and living descendants who could prove ownership, others presented significant challenges. Records had been destroyed during the war. Families had been scattered across the globe, and in some cases, entire family lines had been wiped out with no surviving heirs to claim the property. A special task force was assembled to handle the restitution process. Lawyers, historians, genealogists, and art experts worked together, spending hundreds of hours researching each piece and tracking down anyone with a legitimate claim. Robert watched this process unfold over the months that followed his discovery, amazed by the dedication of the people involved. They weren't just doing their jobs, they were on a mission to right historical wrongs, to return what had been stolen to those who'd suffered the loss. One of the more remarkable cases involved a series of 3 paintings that had belonged to a Jewish collector in Paris. The collector and his entire immediate family had perished in concentration camps, but investigators managed to track down a distant cousin living in Argentina. The woman, now in her 70s, had no idea these paintings existed or that her relatives had owned such valuable artwork. When she was contacted and told about the discovery, she initially thought it was a scam. It took weeks of official documentation and phone calls before she believed it was real. Robert was present when she came to see the paintings. Having flown all the way from Buenos Aires, she stood in front of the 3 landscapes, views of the French countryside rendered in impressionist style, and listened as a translator explained how they'd been found. Through her tears, she said something in Spanish that the translator repeated in English. "I never knew them. They died before I was born. But this makes them real to me in a way nothing else ever has. These paintings prove they existed, that they had lives and dreams and beautiful things. Thank you for finding them. Thank you for bringing them home." Stories like this one played out again and again as the restitution process continued. Each reunion between artwork and descendants was emotional, powerful, and deeply meaningful. But not every case ended in reunion. 4 of the paintings couldn't be linked to any surviving family members despite extensive searches. After exhausting all possible leads, the task force decided these pieces would be donated to museums with the stipulation that they be displayed with information about their history, their theft, their recovery, and the families they'd been stolen from. The monetary value of the collection was staggering. Experts estimated the total worth at somewhere between $40 and $50 million. The most valuable single piece was a portrait attributed to a well-known 17th-century Dutch master, valued at approximately $8 million on its own. But the families who received their artwork back were unanimous in their response. The emotional value far exceeded any monetary worth. These weren't just expensive paintings. They were heirlooms, family treasures, connections to ancestors and a world that had been destroyed. Robert found himself thinking about this often as the months passed. He'd spent 15 years in the mine, pulling rocks and minerals from the earth, extracting resources that had monetary value. But nothing he'd ever done in those 15 years had meant as much as accidentally hitting his pickaxe against that brick wall. The value he'd uncovered had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with human connection, memory, and justice. The mine owner approached Robert about 6 months after the discovery. They met in his office, a wood-paneled room filled with old photographs of the mine's history. "I've been getting calls," the owner said, settling into his chair, "from some of the families whose artwork you found. Several of them want to give you a finder's fee. They're talking about substantial amounts of money." Robert shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't found the art for money. He'd just been doing his job. "I don't know about that," he said. "I told them you'd say that." The owner smiled. "But here's the thing, Robert. You gave these people back something they never thought they'd see again, something that connects them to family members they lost, to a history that was almost erased. If they want to show their gratitude, maybe you should let them." In the end, 5 families insisted on providing finder's fees. The amounts varied, but in total, Robert received nearly $200,000. It was more money than he'd ever imagined having. His wife wanted to pay off the mortgage and maybe take a real vacation for the first time in years. But Robert had other ideas. He donated half of it to organizations that worked on art restitution and Holocaust education. The rest he put in a college fund for his grandchildren. The story of the Blackwood mine discovery began to spread beyond just the art world. A documentary filmmaker approached Robert about making a film about the find. Major news networks ran features on the story. A popular podcast did a 3-part series exploring the history of wartime art looting and how the Blackwood discovery fit into that larger narrative. Robert gave interviews when asked, but he always tried to keep the focus on the art itself and the families it belonged to, rather than on his own role in finding it. About a year after the initial discovery, Dr. Chen contacted Robert with an interesting proposal. The State Historical Society wanted to create a permanent exhibit about the find, and they hoped to use the actual chamber where the art had been hidden as part of the display. Would the mine owner be willing to allow public access to that section of the mine? The mine owner loved the idea. The chamber would be preserved exactly as Robert had found it, minus the artwork, of course, and the rest of that section of tunnel would be converted into a small museum space. Visitors could see the brick wall, still partially intact, and walk into the chamber where millions of dollars worth of stolen art had sat hidden for nearly 8 decades. Display panels would tell the story of the looting, the hiding, and the eventual recovery. Most importantly, photographs and information about each piece of artwork and the families they belonged to would be featured prominently. Robert was asked to help design the exhibit, to provide first-hand accounts of the discovery and help recreate the experience for visitors. He worked closely with museum designers and historians, describing exactly what he'd seen and felt that day when he first broke through the wall. They even installed a replica of one of the crates, filled with reproductions of some of the paintings, so visitors could get a sense of what the discovery had looked like. The museum opened 18 months after the initial discovery. The opening ceremony drew a large crowd, local residents, art historians, journalists, and remarkably, several of the families whose artwork had been recovered. Ruth Goldstein was there along with her family. The woman from Argentina came, bringing her adult children. Others who'd received back pieces of their family history made the journey to see where their treasures had been hidden all those years. Robert gave a speech at the opening, something he'd been nervous about for weeks. He wasn't good with public speaking, and the crowd was much larger than he'd expected. But when he stood at the podium and looked out at all those faces, he realized he didn't need to be eloquent. He just needed to be honest. "I'm just a miner," he began. "For 15 years, I've gone down into the earth every day to do my job. I never expected to find anything more interesting than maybe a nice rock or an old fossil. But what I found changed my life, and more importantly, changed the lives of families who thought their history was lost forever. This isn't really about me. It's about remembering. It's about understanding that history isn't just dates in a textbook. It's real people, real families, real losses, and real recoveries. And it's about the fact that sometimes the most important things are hidden in places we least expect, waiting for someone to find them and bring them back into the light." The applause was genuine and heartfelt. After the ceremony, people came up to Robert to thank him, to shake his hand, to share their own stories of family history and loss. He listened to each one, honored that they'd choose to share these intimate details with him. The museum became more successful than anyone had anticipated. School groups came to learn about World War II and the cultural destruction that occurred during that period. Art lovers came to see the chamber and understand the incredible luck involved in the preservation of these pieces. History enthusiasts came to marvel at the story, and survivors and their families came to pay their respects to the memories of those who'd lost everything. Robert continued working at the mine, though his role shifted somewhat. A few days a week, he'd come up from whatever tunnel he was working in to help give tours of the museum section, particularly to school groups. He enjoyed talking to kids about the discovery, watching their eyes get wide when he described breaking through the wall and seeing the paintings for the first time. He especially enjoyed answering their questions, which ranged from practical, "Weren't you scared?" to philosophical, "How did it feel to find something so important?" The answer to that second question evolved over time. Initially, Robert would say he felt excited or amazed, but as the months and years passed, he came to understand that what he'd really felt, and continued to feel, was a sense of responsibility. He'd been given the opportunity to correct a historical wrong, to return stolen property to its rightful owners, to help families reconnect with their past. That was a responsibility he didn't take lightly, and it shaped how he thought about his life and his work. 3 years after the discovery, Robert received a letter from an unexpected source. It was from the granddaughter of Friedrich Weber, the man who'd hidden the art in the chamber. She'd read about the discovery and wanted to apologize, though she acknowledged that no apology could undo what her grandfather had done. She explained that she'd grown up not knowing about this part of her family history and felt ashamed when she learned the truth. She asked if there was anything she could do to help with restitution efforts or education about this dark chapter of history. Robert wrote back, encouraging her to volunteer with one of the Holocaust education organizations. He also invited her to visit the museum to see firsthand what had been discovered and to understand the full impact of the story. She came several months later, and Robert spent an afternoon with her, walking her through the exhibit and explaining how each piece had been returned to its owners. By the end of the visit, she was in tears, but she thanked him for his kindness and for not judging her based on her grandfather's actions. "We can't change the past," Robert told her, "but we can learn from it and make sure we do better going forward. That's all any of us can do." The police arrived at the mine within 2 hours of Bill's phone call. Not just local officers either, but detectives and even some federal agents who'd been contacted because of the potential significance of the find. Robert watched from the parking lot as more and more official vehicles pulled up, their lights flashing in the early afternoon sun. What had started as a normal workday had turned into something completely extraordinary. He was asked to give a statement, describing exactly how he'd found the wall and what he'd seen inside the chamber. The detective taking his statement kept asking him to repeat certain details, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Robert didn't blame him. He still couldn't quite believe it himself. By late afternoon, the mine had been cleared of all regular workers. Only essential personnel were allowed to remain, along with the growing number of investigators and specialists who kept arriving. Robert was told he could go home, but he refused. This was his discovery, and he wanted to see it through. Bill backed him up, insisting that Robert should be present as they documented everything. The real excitement began when the art experts arrived. The first to show up was a professor from the state university, a woman in her 60s who'd spent her entire career studying art history. Her name was Dr. Patricia Chen, and the moment she climbed back up from the chamber after her initial inspection, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. "I need to make some calls," she said to the lead detective. "International calls. This is beyond anything I've ever seen." "What are we looking at here, doctor?" the detective asked. Dr. Chen took off her glasses and cleaned them, a gesture that seemed more about buying time to compose herself than about actually cleaning the lenses. "I recognized at least 6 pieces down there. 6 pieces that I know for certain were reported stolen during World War II, looted from private collections, museums, galleries across occupied Europe. And if those 6 are authentic, which I believe they are, then the rest of the collection likely has a similar origin." Robert felt his stomach drop. World War II, that was over 80 years ago. These paintings had been hidden down there for 8 decades, maybe longer. He thought about all the people who'd owned these artworks, who'd had them stolen from their homes during one of the darkest periods in human history, and here they were, buried beneath the earth in a small mining town in America. More experts arrived over the next few days. Specialists in stolen art, historians who dedicated their careers to tracking down cultural property looted during the war, even representatives from international organizations that dealt with art restitution. The mine became a hub of activity with people coming and going at all hours. The chamber was photographed from every angle, each crate and its contents meticulously documented before anything was moved. Robert was allowed back into the chamber on the 3rd day after the discovery, accompanied by Dr. Chen and several other experts. Watching them work was fascinating. They handled each painting with extreme care, wearing gloves and using special tools to examine the artwork without causing any damage. They took notes, consulted thick reference books, and frequently showed each other details on their phones, comparisons to photographs of the same pieces taken decades ago. "Before they disappeared, this one," Dr. Chen said, gesturing to a landscape painting that showed a river winding through mountains, was taken from a collector in Vienna in 1941. The family reported it stolen, along with 30 other pieces from their home. This is the first time any of those works has been seen since then. Another expert, a man from an organization based in Washington that tracked stolen cultural property, was examining a portrait of a military officer on horseback. "I've been looking for this painting for 15 years, he said quietly. "The original owner's granddaughter has been trying to locate it. She's in her 80s now, living in Israel. She's going to be, I don't even know." Overjoyed doesn't seem like a strong enough word. As they worked, a picture began to emerge of how these artworks had ended up in the chamber. Historical records were examined, old mine employee files were dug out of storage, and gradually investigators pieced together a story. In 1946, a man named Friedrich Weber had taken a job as a supervisor at the Blackwood mine. He'd immigrated to America from Germany just before the war started, establishing himself in the community and keeping a low profile. What nobody knew at the time was that Weber had connections back in Germany, specifically, connections to officers who were actively involved in looting artwork from occupied territories. Apparently, Weber had been part of a network designed to smuggle stolen art out of Europe and hide it in America, where it could be retrieved after the war when things settled down. The mine, with its extensive network of tunnels and limited oversight in certain sections, would have been the perfect hiding place. But he never retrieved the art, Robert said as Dr. Chen explained this history to him. "Why not?" "Because he died," she replied, pulling up a scanned newspaper article on her tablet. "Mining accident in 1947. Collapsed tunnel in a different section of the mine. He was killed instantly, along with 2 other workers. The secret of the chamber died with him." Robert thought about that. 78 years these paintings had sat in darkness because one man died before he could retrieve them. If Weber had lived, these artworks probably would have been sold on the black market, lost forever to their rightful owners. In a strange way, that accident had preserved them, kept them safe until Robert, could find them and return them to where they belonged. The contents of the chamber were extensive. In total, there were 42 paintings ranging from small portraits to large-scale historical scenes. Some were by famous artists whose names even Robert recognized, though Dr. Chen cautioned that they'd need extensive authentication before they could be certain of the attributions. There were also sculptures, jewelry, ornate religious objects, and documents that appeared to be bills of sale and ownership records, probably forged, used to give the artwork a false provenance. One of the most poignant discoveries was a small wooden box tucked into the corner of one crate. Inside were letters written in German that appeared to be correspondence between Weber and his contacts in Europe. An interpreter was brought in to translate them, and what they revealed was chilling. The letters discussed the art as if it were just merchandise, referring to pieces by their monetary value rather than their cultural significance. There was no acknowledgement of the people who'd been robbed, no recognition of the history being destroyed. But there were also lists, detailed lists of where each piece had been taken from, including names of the original owners. This documentation, as terrible as its existence was, would prove invaluable in returning the artwork to its rightful owners or their descendants. Every piece could be traced back to a specific theft, a specific family, a specific moment when someone's treasured possession had been ripped away from them. As word of the discovery spread, the media descended on the town. News trucks parked outside the mine. Reporters tried to interview anyone connected to the story, and Robert found himself suddenly famous in a way he'd never wanted or expected. He gave a few interviews, describing the moment he'd found the wall, but he tried to deflect attention away from himself and toward the importance of returning the art to its owners. The mine owner, to his credit, made it clear from the beginning that he had no claim to the artwork. "This doesn't belong to us," he told reporters. "This belongs to the families it was stolen from. We're just glad we could play a part in making sure it gets back to them." Approximately 3 weeks after the discovery, the first family members arrived to see the recovered artwork. An elderly woman named Ruth Goldstein, accompanied by her daughter and grandson, came to identify a painting that had belonged to her grandparents. The painting showed a garden scene, vibrant with flowers and sunlight, and had hung in their home in Amsterdam until 1943. Robert was present when they brought Ruth into the secure facility where the artwork was being stored and studied. Dr. Chen carefully showed her the painting, explaining its condition and how it had been found. Ruth stood in front of it, silent, tears streaming down her face. Her daughter held her arm, crying as well. "I remember this," Ruth said finally, her voice barely audible. "I was only 7 years old, but I remember it. It hung in the dining room. My grandmother loved this painting. She'd sit and look at it for hours, especially in winter when there were no flowers in the garden. She reached out as if to touch it, then pulled her hand back. They took everything from us. Not just the artwork, but everything. My grandparents, my uncle, my aunt. Only my mother and I survived. And this painting, I never thought I'd see it again." Robert had to step outside. The weight of what they'd found, what it meant to people like Ruth, was overwhelming. These weren't just valuable objects. They were memories, connections to lost loved ones, pieces of lives that had been shattered by war and hatred, and they'd been sitting in that chamber in the dark, waiting to be found and returned. The authentication process took months. Each painting had to be examined by multiple experts, compared to historical records and photographs, analyzed with modern technology to confirm its age and origin. But slowly, piece by piece, the collection was verified. Out of the 42 paintings, 39 were confirmed as looted artwork. The other 3 were still under investigation, their origins less clear from the available documentation. The jewelry and other objects were similarly authenticated. Everything had value, both monetary and historical. But more than that, everything had a story of loss and theft, but also now a story of recovery and return. The chamber beneath the Blackwood mine had kept these stories safe, preserving them against time and decay, waiting for the day when they could finally be told. Robert arrived at the mine even earlier than usual the next morning. He'd tossed and turned all night, his mind filled with images of what might be waiting behind that brick wall. His wife had noticed his restlessness and asked him what was going on. When he told her about the discovery, she'd given him that look she always did when she thought he was getting too worked up about something. But she didn't understand. This was the most exciting thing that had happened to him in years. The mine owner had arranged for proper documentation equipment, better cameras, additional lighting and safety gear in case there were any hazards behind the wall. Robert met with Bill and 2 safety inspectors before heading down. They went over the plan carefully. Robert would remove the bricks slowly and methodically, checking for structural issues as he went. If there was any sign of instability, they'd stop immediately and bring in structural engineers. The descent into the mine felt different today. Usually, Robert just zoned out during the elevator ride, thinking about nothing in particular. But today, every foot they dropped felt like moving closer to answers. When they finally reached the bottom and made their way to Tunnel 7 East, Robert felt his pulse quicken. The brick wall looked exactly as he'd left it, unchanged and silent, keeping its secrets. He started at the top, where the mortar had crumbled the most. Using a chisel and hammer, he carefully worked at the joints between bricks, loosening them one at a time. The first brick came free with surprising ease. Behind it, there was only darkness. Robert shined his flashlight through the small opening, but couldn't see much. He kept working, removing bricks one by one, creating a gap large enough to peer through. As the opening grew larger, something strange happened. Air began flowing through the gap. Not a gentle breeze, but a definite current of air moving from the chamber beyond into the tunnel where they stood. It carried with it a smell that made Robert wrinkle his nose. It was musty and old, like opening an attic that hadn't been entered in decades, but there was something else mixed in, something metallic and mineral-rich that he couldn't quite identify. "You smell that?" Robert asked Bill, who was standing nearby with a handheld gas detector. "Yeah, I smell it, but the detector's not showing anything dangerous. No methane, no carbon monoxide. Just old air." Bill leaned closer to the opening. "How's it looking in there?" Robert removed a few more bricks and shined his flashlight through the enlarged gap. What he saw made him pause. It's not just another tunnel. It's a room. A big one. A room. Natural or man-made? Man-made, definitely. The walls look carved, not blasted. Smooth surfaces. Real deliberate work. The safety inspectors moved closer, their interest clearly piqued. One of them said, "We need to be careful here. If someone went to the trouble of sealing this off, there might be a reason. Could be unstable ground, could be flooding risk, could be anything. But Robert could see into the chamber now. And there was no water, no obvious structural damage. What he could see, barely visible in the beam of his flashlight, were objects, shapes that looked like boxes or crates stacked against the far wall. Man-made objects, which meant someone had used this chamber for storage. But storage of what? And why seal it off so completely? He worked faster now, his curiosity overriding his caution. More bricks came loose, tumbling inward and clattering on what sounded like a stone floor. The opening was nearly large enough for a person to fit through. Robert grabbed one of the portable lights they'd brought and tossed it through the gap. The LED light hit the ground and rolled, its beam sweeping across the chamber and illuminating what lay within. "Holy," Bill breathed, pressing his face close to the opening to get a better look. The chamber was roughly 30 feet across and maybe 20 feet deep. The walls were indeed smooth and deliberately carved, not the rough-hewn surfaces typical of mine tunnels. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating this space. But more importantly, scattered throughout the chamber were wooden crates and boxes. Lots of them. Maybe 20 or 30 containers of various sizes, all looking incredibly old. Robert didn't wait for permission. He started removing bricks even faster, enlarging the opening until it was big enough for him to climb through. Bill grabbed his arm. "Wait, we need to do this right. Safety protocols, the room's stable. The air's clean. I'm going in." Before Bill could argue further, Robert squeezed through the opening, his boots hitting the stone floor of the chamber with a soft thud. He grabbed the portable light and held it up, turning in a slow circle to take in the full scope of the room. It was incredible. The ceiling was maybe 12 feet high, supported by natural rock formations that had been left in place. Whoever carved this space knew what they were doing. He moved toward the nearest crate. It was made of wood that had darkened with age, and the corners were reinforced with metal brackets that had developed a patina of rust. There were no markings on the outside, no labels or writing to indicate what might be inside. Robert ran his hand along the top of the crate. The wood felt solid despite its age, well preserved by the stable temperature and low humidity of the underground environment. "Robert, what do you see?" Bill called from beyond the wall. "Crates. Lots of them, old ones. Really old, don't open anything yet. We need to document this properly." But Robert's hands were already searching for a way to open the nearest crate. He found that the lid wasn't nailed down, but rather held in place by metal clasps that had been designed to be opened and closed. His fingers worked at the mechanisms, which were stiff from years of disuse. With some effort, one clasp popped open, then another. He lifted the lid slowly, half expecting it to crumble to dust in his hands. Inside the crate, wrapped in what looked like waxed cloth or oilcloth, were rectangular packages. Robert's heart was hammering now. He carefully lifted out the topmost package. It was surprisingly heavy. Whatever was inside had some weight to it. He set it down gently on top of another crate and began unwrapping the protective covering. The cloth was stiff and crackled slightly as he peeled it back. Layer after layer came away until finally he reached what was inside. And then he stopped breathing. He just stared, unable to process what he was seeing. In his hands was a painting, an actual genuine old painting in an ornate gilt frame. The image showed a woman in historical dress, the kind of fancy gown you'd see in a museum, standing beside a window with a landscape visible behind her. "Bill," Robert called out, his voice sounding strange even to his own ears. "You need to get in here, right now." Something in his tone must have conveyed the urgency because moments later, Bill was squeezing through the opening, followed by the two safety inspectors. They gathered around Robert, staring at the painting he held. "Is that what I think it is?" one of the inspectors asked quietly. Robert didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the crate and pulled out another package. He unwrapped it to reveal another painting, this one showing a religious scene with figures in robes gathered around a central figure. The style was clearly old, the kind of technique that modern artists didn't use anymore. Each brushstroke was visible, the paint built up in layers that gave the image depth and richness. Bill walked over to another crate and opened it. More packages, more paintings. He unwrapped one, then another, each reveal more stunning than the last. Landscapes of rolling hills and ancient forests, portraits of men in military uniforms and women in jewels, still lifes of fruit and flowers that looked so real you could almost reach out and touch them. "How many crates are there?" Bill asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert counted quickly. 27, maybe 28, and if they're all full of paintings. Nobody finished the sentence. They didn't need to. The implications were enormous. Someone had hidden a massive collection of artwork down here, sealing it behind a brick wall in an abandoned section of the mine. But why? Who did these paintings belong to? And how long had they been here? Robert moved to a smaller crate near the back of the chamber. This one contained different items: jewelry boxes, small sculptures, ornate silverware wrapped in tarnished cloth. Each piece looked antique and valuable. There were also papers, documents of some kind, though they were written in languages Robert couldn't read. German, maybe? And French? One of the safety inspectors, a younger guy named Tom, was slowly walking around the chamber, shining his flashlight on everything. "Look at the floor," he said suddenly. Robert looked down. The stone floor was covered in a fine layer of dust, but near the entrance, the brick wall they'd broken through, there were marks. Scratches in the stone and what looked like old mortar drippings. Someone had built that wall from inside the chamber, then presumably exited through some other route before that too was sealed. Or maybe they'd sealed themselves in. Robert shook off that disturbing thought. "We need to call the police," Bill said finally, "and probably some other authorities. Art experts or something. This is way beyond anything we're qualified to handle." Robert nodded, though he couldn't take his eyes off the paintings. Each one was a masterpiece. That much was obvious even to someone like him who knew nothing about art. The skill involved in creating these images was extraordinary, and they'd been sitting here in the dark for decades, maybe longer, waiting to be found. As they climbed back through the opening in the brick wall, Robert took one last look at the chamber. The portable light they'd left inside cast long shadows across the walls, illuminating the crates that held their treasures. Tomorrow this place would be swarming with investigators and experts. The secret would be out, but for now, for just a few more hours, only a handful of people knew about this hidden gallery beneath the earth. The ride back to the surface felt surreal. Robert kept thinking about those paintings, those beautiful works of art that someone had gone to such extraordinary lengths to hide. Who were they running from? What were they afraid of? And why choose a mineshaft as a hiding place? These questions spun through his mind as the elevator carried them back up to the world of sunlight and fresh air, leaving the secrets of the deep behind, at least for now. The alarm clock went off at 4:30 in the morning, just like it had for the past 15 years. Robert rubbed his eyes and sat up in bed, already knowing exactly how his day would go. Coffee, toast, drive to the mine, descend into the darkness, swing a pickaxe for 8 hours, come home tired. It was the same routine, day after day, and honestly, he'd gotten used to it. Some guys complained about working in the mines, but Robert didn't mind it much. The pay was decent, the work kept him in shape, and there was something almost meditative about the repetitive nature of it all. That particular Tuesday in March started like any other. The sun hadn't even thought about rising yet when Robert pulled into the parking lot of the Blackwood mine. The old facility had been operating since the 1880s, pulling coal and various minerals from deep beneath the earth. Most of the original tunnels had been exhausted or sealed off years ago, but the company kept finding new veins to explore, new sections to excavate. That's what Robert was assigned to do that week, clear out an old tunnel that hadn't been used in decades. Management wanted to turn it into storage space for equipment. He grabbed his helmet, adjusted his headlamp, and headed to the elevator shaft with a few other workers. The descent always made his ears pop. Down, down, down they went, the temperature dropping as they left the surface world behind. When the elevator finally lurched to a stop, Robert was nearly 800 feet below ground. The air down there had a particular smell: damp earth, mineral deposits, and the faint odor of diesel from the machinery. You never really got used to it, but you stopped noticing it after a while. The tunnel he'd been assigned to was in the eastern section, one of the older parts of the mine. As Robert walked through the main passages with his pickaxe slung over his shoulder, he passed exposed rock walls that showed the geological history of the region. Layers upon layers of sediment, compressed over millions of years. It was actually pretty fascinating when you stopped to think about it. He was walking through time itself. When he reached his work area, Robert set down his water bottle and got to business. The tunnel was narrow here, barely wide enough for two men to walk side by side. Decades of dust had settled on everything, and his first task was to clear away the loose debris so they could assess the structural integrity. He swung his pickaxe methodically, breaking up the accumulated dirt and small rocks, shoveling them into a cart that would be hauled away. About 2 hours into his shift, something changed. The sound changed. Instead of the familiar crack and crumble of his pickaxe hitting natural rock and sediment, he heard a different noise, a hollow thud. Robert stopped mid-swing and frowned. He struck the same spot again. Thud. That wasn't right. Rock didn't sound like that.